I'm Blythe Thorne, 52, and I turned a single roadside flower stand into a multi-million-dollar botanical empire just so my daughter would never have to know the feeling of dirt underneath her fingernails. The bridal suite smelled like a funeral parlor, which was ironic, considering I had personally arranged every single stem of the Casablanca lilies perfuming the room. My hands were shaking, not from age, but from the adrenaline of signing the deed to a 5-bedroom colonial in the hills just 3 hours ago. It was in my purse, wrapped in a silk ribbon waiting to be placed in the birdcage card holder downstairs. I adjusted the pearl clasp on my necklace, staring at my reflection in the vanity mirror, trying to convince myself that the dark circles under my eyes looked like wisdom rather than exhaustion. The door clicked shut behind me, the sound sharp and deliberate. I didn't turn around immediately, assuming it was the makeup artist coming back for a touch-up. "The flowers are overwhelming, Blythe," a voice said, smooth and cold as polished marble. I spun around on my heel. Jard stood there, looking every inch the perfect groom in his bespoke tuxedo, a glass of scotch resting casually in his hand. He didn't smile. "They're lilies, Jard," I said, forcing a warmth into my tone I didn't feel. "They signify purity and commitment. It's what Chloe wanted." He took a step closer, invading my personal space in a way that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. "Chloe wants a lot of things," he murmured, taking a slow sip of his drink. "But we need to discuss what I want." My stomach tightened, a familiar knot of anxiety that I usually reserved for boardroom negotiations. I reached for my purse on the velvet settee. "Actually, I have something for you both," I said, my voice trembling slightly as I pulled out the envelope. "I wasn't going to give it to you until the toasts, but it's the deed to the house on Sycamore Ridge, paid in full." I held it out, a peace offering, a life-changing gift that cost me 3 years of liquid assets. Jar didn't take it. He didn't even look at it. He looked right into my eyes, his pupils blown wide, devoid of any gratitude or warmth. "That's generous," he said, the word dripping with sarcasm. "But that's not the gift I'm interested in." He set his glass down on the vanity with a heavy clink that echoed in the silent room. He leaned in, close enough that I could smell the expensive musk of his cologne mixed with the alcohol on his breath. "My wedding gift, Blythe," he whispered, his voice dropping to a menace that froze the blood in my veins, "is for you to disappear." I blinked, sure I had misheard him. "Excuse me?" I breathed out, my grip on the envelope tightening until the paper crinkled. "You heard me," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "You've played the benevolent matriarch long enough. You bought the dress, you bought the flowers, you bought the house, you think you own her." "I love her," I countered, my voice rising. "You smother her," he cut me off, his eyes narrowing into slits. "So here is the deal. You smile, you walk her down the aisle, and the moment the reception ends, you vanish. No Sunday dinners, no surprise visits. No calling her crying about how lonely you are in that big empty mansion." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. "You can't keep me from my daughter," I whispered, horror washing over me. "Watch me," he smiled, and it was the cruelest expression I had ever seen. "If you don't step back, I'll make sure she knows exactly how manipulative you really are. I'll make her hate you, Blythe. And you know she listens to me." He plucked the envelope from my frozen fingers. "Thanks for the house," he said, tucking it into his inner jacket pocket. "Consider it your severance package." The air in the room instantly turned into solid concrete. I tried to inhale, but my lungs refused to expand. My chest felt like it was being crushed by a hydraulic press. His words hung between us, toxic and heavy, poisoning the scent of the lilies I had spent hours selecting. I stared at the pocket where he had just stashed the deed to a home I had spent my life savings on. He didn't blink, he didn't flinch. He just stood there with that terrifyingly calm smirk swirling the amber liquid in his glass. My vision blurred, panic clawing at the edges of my consciousness. I looked past his broad, tuxedo-clad shoulder toward the double glass doors leading to the garden. There she was, Chloe. She was standing in a sunbeam, surrounded by a flutter of pastel bridesmaids. She reached up to adjust the delicate lace of her veil, her head thrown back in a laugh that I couldn't hear but knew by heart. She looked radiant. She looked hopeful. She looked completely, devastatingly oblivious to the fact that the man she was about to pledge her life to was holding a knife to her mother's throat. I felt a wave of nausea so violent I had to grip the edge of the vanity to keep from collapsing. Jard saw my gaze shift and took a deliberate step to the right. He blocked the glass door. He blocked my view of her. He eclipsed the sunbeam, casting me back into his shadow. "Don't look at her like a victim, Blythe," he said, his voice low and smooth like oil on water. "She's happy, and she'll stay happy as long as you aren't hovering over her shoulder, critiquing the way she breathes." "I have never," I choked out, my voice sounding foreign and brittle. "You are a stain on our future," he interrupted, his eyes dead and flat. "An overbearing, suffocating stain. You project your own failures onto her." He took another sip of his scotch, savoring my devastation. "If you truly love her," he said, leaning down so his face was level with mine, "you will let her go. You will walk out of that reception hall tonight and you will never look back." Tears pricked my eyes, hot and stinging. "And if I scream?" I whispered, my fingernails digging into the wood of the vanity. "If I walk out there right now and tell her what you just said?" He laughed, a short, sharp sound that chilled my marrow. "She thinks I'm her savior, Blythe. You're just the bank account." He checked his watch, a Rolex I had bought him for his engagement gift. "You have 10 minutes to fix your face," he said, turning toward the door. "Don't make a scene unless you want to ruin the happiest day of her life." He walked out, leaving me gasping for air in a room full of dying flowers. I'm Blythe Thorne, 52, and I turned a single roadside flower stand into a multi-million-dollar botanical empire just so my daughter would never have to know the feeling of dirt underneath her fingernails. The click of the door latch echoed like a gunshot in the silence of the bridal suite. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the white painted wood, waiting for the inevitable collapse. I waited for the sob that would rack my body, for the knees to buckle, for the desperate urge to run after him and beg for scraps of my daughter's time. But the collapse didn't come. Instead, the air in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. The suffocating heat of panic that had flushed my skin only seconds ago evaporated, leaving behind a chilling, absolute numbness. It started at my fingertips, creeping up my arms, freezing the blood in my veins until I felt less like a woman and more like a statue carved from ice. This wasn't shock. This was clarity. For 25 years, I had operated on the warmth of maternal love, fueling my entire existence with the burning desire to give Chloe the world. But Jard had just extinguished that flame with a single, cruel ultimatum. He wanted me to disappear. He wanted me to be a ghost. Fine. I took a deep breath, the scent of the Casablanca lilies no longer smelling like a funeral, but like a business transaction that had just been terminated. I turned my back on the door. My movements were slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly calm. I walked across the plush cream carpet toward the small, skirted table in the corner where we had staged the detail shots for the photographer earlier that morning. There it was, the velvet envelope. Jard, in his arrogance, had made a mistake. He had tucked the card into his pocket, the one with the sentimental note, but he had left the actual heavy lifting, the financial backbone of their future, sitting right there next to Chloe's backup earrings. Or perhaps he hadn't made a mistake. Perhaps he was so confident in his emotional stranglehold on my daughter that he thought he didn't need the physical deed in his hand to own her. He thought I would leave it there for them. He thought I would leave weeping and broken, and he would circle back later to collect the spoils of his victory. I reached out, my hand steady as a surgeon's. I touched the crushed navy velvet. It felt soft, expensive, and heavy with promise. Inside this envelope was a cashier's check for $50,000, money intended for a Bora Bora honeymoon. Behind that check lay the deed to the Sycamore Ridge estate, a property I had fought a bidding war to secure, a home where I had envisioned my future grandchildren playing in the sunroom. I ran my thumb over the seal. The weight of the betrayal settled deep in my bones, heavier than the paper, heavier than the gold bullion I kept in my safe. He called me a stain. He called me a bank account. I picked up the envelope. It felt like holding a grenade that I had decided not to throw, but to dismantle. I didn't open it to check the contents. I knew exactly what was inside because I had earned every single penny that paid for it. I walked over to the settee where my silk clutch lay open. I didn't rush. There was no frantic stuffing of documents, no glancing over my shoulder. I slid the velvet envelope inside the clutch, nesting it against my lipstick and my cell phone. The snap of the clutch closing was the only sound in the room. It was a final sound. It was the sound of a vault door locking. I caught my reflection in the vanity mirror again. The terrified mother with the pleading eyes was gone. Staring back at me was Blythe Thorne, the CEO, the woman who had negotiated hostile takeovers and survived market crashes. My eyes were dry. My jaw was set. Jard wanted me to walk out of the reception and never look back. I would do him one better. I wouldn't even stay for the reception. I wouldn't stay for the cake cutting, or the first dance, or the speeches where he would undoubtedly spin a web of lies about his love and devotion. I smoothed the fabric of my dress, a gown that cost more than his car. I picked up my clutch. The weight of it in my hand was grounding. I wasn't leaving my daughter because I didn't love her. I was leaving because the only way to save her from the monster she was marrying was to remove the one thing he wanted most, my resources. He wanted to isolate her. He would have to do it in a rented apartment, not a mansion paid for by the woman he despised. I walked to the door, my heels sinking slightly into the carpet, silent and lethal. I reached for the handle. I didn't look back at the flowers. I didn't look back at the empty room where my heart had been broken. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, the cool air of the hotel corridor hitting my face. I was disappearing just like he asked, but I was taking my empire with me. I'm Blythe Thorne, 52, and I spent 2 decades building a multi-million-dollar botanical empire from a patch of dirt, only to realize I've cultivated a garden that has no room for me. The first chord of the string quartet struck the air, vibrating through the thick oak doors of the chapel vestibule. It was Pachelbel's Canon in D. The melody was soft, sweet, and suffocatingly familiar. It was the song Chloe had chosen when she was 12 years old, dancing around our living room with a pillowcase on her head. Hearing it now didn't bring a tear to my eye. It sent a shard of ice straight through my chest. Through the crack in the double doors, I could see the guests rising from the pews. I saw the backs of their heads. I saw the expensive hats and the perfectly coiffed hair of people I had fed, entertained, and impressed for years. They were all waiting for the mother of the bride. They were waiting for me to walk down the aisle, dab a handkerchief to my eyes, and take my seat in the front row. They were waiting for the performance. Jard was up there at the altar. I couldn't see him, but I could feel his presence like a drop in barometric pressure. He was checking his watch. He was smirking. He was waiting for me to come in and play the obedient, bankrolling matron he had commanded me to be. He thought he had won. He thought the threat of estrangement was a collar he could snap around my neck to make me heel. My hand tightened around my silk clutch. The velvet envelope inside pressed against my palm through the fabric. $50,000, the deed to the Sycamore Ridge estate. The future he thought he had secured. It was all right here in my hand, heavy and cold. I took a step toward the main doors, my body moving on autopilot, conditioned by years of putting my daughter first. Then I stopped. I looked at the brass handle of the sanctuary door. If I walked through there, I was accepting his terms. If I sat in that pew, I was agreeing to be a ghost in my own daughter's life. I was agreeing to let him isolate her, control her, and drain me dry from a distance. No, my heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I turned my head to the left. There was a heavy wooden side door, an exit used by the choir and the florists. It was shadowed. It was quiet. It led away from the flowers, away from the vows, away from the daughter who didn't know she was marrying a predator. I took a breath that tasted of stale incense and expensive perfume. I pivoted on my heel. The movement was sharp. I walked toward the side door. My legs felt heavy, as if I were wading through waist-deep water. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn back, to run to Chloe, to throw myself between her and the altar. But I knew Jard. I knew that a scene would only cement his narrative. She's crazy, Chloe, she's jealous, she's trying to ruin your day. The only way to win this war was to refuse to fight the battle he had staged. I pushed the heavy iron latch of the side door. It gave way with a low groan that was swallowed by the swelling music of the strings. I stepped out into the blinding afternoon sun. The heat hit me instantly, a stark contrast to the climate-controlled chill of the chapel. The door clicked shut behind me. The music was instantly muffled, reduced to a dull, rhythmic thrumming against the stone walls. I was outside. I was alone. The gravel of the side path was loose and uneven. I took a step and the stones crunched loudly beneath my designer stiletto. It sounded like breaking bone. I winced, not from the noise, but from the sudden, violent realization of what I was doing. I was leaving. I was actually leaving. I walked faster. My heels sank into the dirt between the stones, threatening to twist my ankle, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't slow down. If I stopped, I would collapse. I rounded the corner of the chapel, the ancient stone roof against my bare shoulder as I brushed past it. The parking lot was a sea of luxury cars gleaming under the sun. My vintage convertible was parked near the back, isolated just like me. I kept my head down. I didn't want to see the chauffeurs smoking by the limo. I didn't want to see the catering staff unloading trays of hors d'oeuvres that I had paid for. I reached my car. My fingers trembled as I dug the keys out of the clutch. They clinked against the velvet envelope. The sound was a reminder. I wasn't just leaving empty-handed. I was taking the leverage. I unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat. The leather was hot against my back, searing through the thin fabric of my gown. It felt grounding. It felt real. I tossed the clutch onto the passenger seat. It landed with a soft thud. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. I looked at the chapel through the windshield. The stained glass windows were dark from the outside, giving away nothing of the ceremony inside. Right now the doors were opening. Right now Chloe was stepping out. She was looking for me. She would scan the front row, her eyes wide and bright behind her veil. She would see the empty seat. She would see the gap where her mother should be. And Jard. He would see it too. He would realize that the severance package he thought he had in his pocket was nothing but a note, and the woman he thought he had broken had simply vanished. A single tear escaped, hot and fast, tracking through my makeup. I wiped it away angrily. I didn't have time for tears. I inserted the key and turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, a guttural growl that shattered the polite silence of the venue. I didn't wait. I didn't look at the clock to see if they were saying, "I do." I shifted into gear. The tires spun slightly on the gravel as I reversed, kicking up a cloud of dust. I swung the car around, pointing the nose toward the exit gate, toward the highway, toward a life that didn't include being a doormat for a man who despised me. I pressed the gas pedal. The car surged forward. I watched the stone chapel shrink in my rearview mirror. It got smaller and smaller, a toy castle in a distance I was creating with every passing second. I wasn't just driving away from a wedding. I was driving away from 20 years of identity. But as the wind caught my hair and the speedometer climbed, I felt something else beneath the crushing weight of grief. I felt lighter. I reached over and placed my hand on the clutch one more time. I had the money. I had the house. And for the first time in a long time, I had my dignity. Jared wanted me to disappear. Careful what you wish for. I'm Blythe Thorne, 52, and I spent a lifetime cultivating a multi-million-dollar empire, only to realize that to save myself, I had to prune my own family tree down to the roots. I drove. I didn't look at the speedometer. I didn't check the rearview mirror to see if anyone was following me. My hands were fused to the leather steering wheel at 10 and 2. My knuckles were stark white, like exposed bone. The sun began to dip below the horizon, bleeding a bruised purple across the sky. It looked like a hematoma spreading over the atmosphere. I pressed the accelerator harder. The engine of my convertible whined, a high-pitched protest against the speed, but I didn't let up. The meticulously manicured landscape of the wedding venue gave way to the jagged silhouette of the city. Lights began to flicker on. They weren't the soft, romantic candles of the reception I had paid for. They were harsh, fluorescent street lamps. They were the garish neon signs of strip malls and 24-hour diners. The wind whipped my hair across my face, stinging my cheeks and blinding me for split seconds. I didn't bother to tie it back. I wanted the sting. I needed to feel something other than the hollow, cavernous ache in the center of my chest. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It vibrated against the leather, an angry, persistent insect. It buzzed again and again. I didn't look at the screen. I knew who it was. It was the daughter I had just abandoned at the altar. Or maybe it was the son-in-law, realizing his golden goose had flown the coop with the golden egg still inside her. I reached over, my eyes still locked on the road. My fingers fumbled with the device until I found the power button. I held it down. The buzzing stopped mid-vibration. The silence that filled the car was sudden and absolute. It was terrifying. It was liberating. I drove until the city lights blurred into streaks of red and yellow, a watercolor painting left out in the rain. I drove until my fuel light screamed at me. I pulled into a motel off the interstate, the kind of place with flickering letters on the sign and oil stains on the pavement. I parked my six-figure car between a rusted pickup truck and a dumpster. I sat there for a moment, the engine ticking as it cooled. My body was trembling. It wasn't a shiver, it was a seismic quake originating from my core. I checked into a room that smelled of stale tobacco and industrial cleaner. I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the mattress, still in my mother of the bride gown. The silk felt ridiculous here. It felt like a costume for a play that had been canceled. I watched the shadows crawl across the peeling wallpaper. I waited for the regret to crush me. I waited for the urge to turn around, to drive back, to beg for forgiveness. But it didn't come. Only anger came. Cold, clarifying anger. When the sun rose, gray and unforgiving, I was already moving. I powered my phone back on. It exploded with notifications. 73 missed calls, 42 texts. Voicemails that would undoubtedly range from confused to vitriolic. I didn't listen to a single one. I dialed a number I knew better than my own social security number. Harrison, I said the moment the line connected. My voice was raspy, like I had swallowed gravel. Blythe, he sounded groggy. It's 6:00 a.m. Is everything all right? I heard about the I need you to execute the liquidation protocols, I interrupted. There was a pause, a heavy, confused silence. The what? The scorched earth contingency, I said, my voice steadying. We discussed it 5 years ago during the merger scare. Blythe, that was for a hostile takeover. That was for corporate warfare. I am in a war, Harrison, I said. Sell it all. The portfolio? Gone. The stocks? Dump them. The Sycamore Ridge estate? I looked at the motel wall. I thought of the nursery I had already started planning in the east wing of that house. I thought of Jard walking through my halls, measuring the drapes, calculating the square footage of his inheritance. Put it on the market immediately, I commanded. List it 20% below market value. I want a cash buyer and I want a closing date by the end of the month. Blythe, you're talking about millions in losses if we rush this. I don't care about the losses, I snapped. I care about the liquidity. I want every asset converted to cash and moved to the Cayman accounts by noon. This is irreversible, he warned. That's the point, I whispered. I hung up. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Now came the hardest part. I opened my contacts list. I scrolled to Chloe. Her picture was a selfie we took at her dress fitting. She was beaming. I was crying happy tears. I stared at her smile. I traced the curve of her cheek on the glass screen. My stomach lurched, a violent heave of nausea. This was my baby. This was the girl I had nursed through fevers, the girl I had held through heartbreaks. But she wasn't that girl anymore. She was a weapon Jard was using to hold a gun to my head. If I kept this line open, he would use her voice to pull the trigger. He would make her cry, he would make her beg, and I would break. I couldn't afford to break. My finger hovered over the screen. I pressed edit. I scrolled to the bottom. The red text glared at me. Block this caller. A tear finally escaped, hot and fast, tracking through the remnants of yesterday's makeup. I gasped, a jagged intake of breath that sounded like a sob. I love you, I whispered to the phone. I love you enough to not let him destroy us both. I pressed the button. The confirmation box appeared. Are you sure? I wasn't. I would never be sure, but I pressed yes. Her name vanished from my favorites. I did the same for Jard. I blocked his parents. I blocked the bridesmaids. I blocked every flying monkey he could possibly send my way. With every tap of my finger, the list grew shorter. With every tap, the silence around me grew thicker. I set the phone down on the nightstand. I stood up. I rolled my shoulders back. A strange sensation washed over me. The heavy, sodden coat of motherhood, the constant worry, the obligation, the desperate need to fix everything slid off my shoulders. It hit the floor with an invisible thud. I felt light. I felt terrifyingly light. I walked into the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. The woman in the mirror looked tired. She looked stripped bare, but her eyes were clear. I grabbed my purse. I grabbed the keys to the convertible. I had no home. I had no family. I had a bank account that was filling up with the wreckage of my past life. I opened the motel door and stepped out into the morning sun. I didn't look back at the unmade bed. I was disappearing. And for the first time in 20 years, I was completely, utterly free. The salt air didn't just rust the metal hinges of my front door, it eroded the woman I used to be. I stood on the porch of my small cottage, watching the Atlantic Ocean churn against the jagged rocks. 3 years. It had been 1,095 days since I drove away from the wedding chapel. 1,095 days since I executed the scorched earth protocol on my own life. I reached up and touched my hair. It wasn't the sleek, dyed chestnut bob of a CEO anymore. It was long, brittle, and bleached to the color of driftwood by the relentless sun. I didn't dye it. I didn't style it, I let the wind handle it. I turned away from the gray horizon and walked into the shop attached to the front of my cottage. The sign above the door read the quiet page: no digital inventory, no website, no credit card machines, cash only. I flipped the sign in the window from closed to open. I walked behind the counter and inhaled. I smelled vanilla, binding glue, and the heavy, musky scent of paper that had survived decades of handling. It was the smell of peace. I picked up a rag and began to dust the spines of a first edition Dickens. My hands were different now, too. They were rougher. My nails were short and unpolished. The diamond rings that used to weigh down my left hand were gone, sold off in a pawn shop in Nevada 2 years ago, not for the money, but to sever the last physical link to my vanity. "Good morning, Mar," a voice called out. I looked up. It was old Mr. Henderson, my neighbor. He knew me as Mara. Everyone here did. Blythe Thorn was a ghost story, a cautionary tale of a rich woman who vanished off the face of the earth. Mara was just the quiet woman who sold used books and walked the beach at dawn. "Morning, Arthur," I said. My voice was softer than it used to be. I didn't bark orders anymore. "Storm's coming in," he said, tapping the barometer on the wall near the door. "Can feel it in my knees." "Let it come," I said. I liked the storms. I liked the violence of the waves because it matched the violence that still lived, dormant, inside my chest. Arthur bought a paperback Western and left. The bell above the door jingled into silence. I was alone again. I made a cup of tea, the ceramic warming my palms. I sat on the stool behind the register and opened a book, but I didn't read the words. I stared at the margin. Sometimes the silence was too loud. Sometimes in the quiet, I could still hear the buzz of that phone on the leather seat of my convertible. 73 missed calls. I wondered for the millionth time what the 74th call would have said. I shook my head, physically dislodging the memory. No, I had chosen this. I had chosen survival. The afternoon dragged on, the sky turning a bruised purple as the storm Arthur predicted began to bruise the horizon. Rain started to lash against the window panes. It wasn't a gentle patter, it was an assault. The wind howled, rattling the old timber of the shop. I stood up to lock the door early. There would be no more customers today. I walked around the counter, my boots thudding softly on the wooden floorboards. I reached for the deadbolt, then I froze. Through the rain-streaked glass, I saw a figure standing on the sidewalk. They weren't moving. They were just standing there, unshielded, letting the freezing rain soak them to the bone. My heart gave a strange, painful lurch. It was a primal reaction, a biological alarm bell ringing in my hindbrain. I squinted. The figure stepped closer to the glass. My hand hovered over the lock. I shouldn't open it. I was a single woman living alone with a hidden fortune in offshore accounts. Paranoia was my roommate. But the posture of the person outside wasn't threatening. It was defeated. It was a slump I recognized. I turned the lock. Click. I pushed the door open. The wind ripped it from my grip, slamming it against the inside wall. Rain sprayed into the shop, cold and biting. "We're closed," I shouted over the roar of the wind. "But you can come in and dry off before you move on." The figure didn't move, they just looked up. The hood of their cheap, waterlogged sweatshirt fell back. The air left my lungs in a violent rush as if I'd been punched in the solar plexus. I grabbed the door frame to keep from falling. The face staring back at me was gaunt. The cheekbones were sharp enough to cut skin. The eyes were hollowed out, rimmed with dark purple bruises of exhaustion. Her hair was stringy and matted, clinging to her skull. She looked 30 years older than she should. She looked like a refugee from a war zone, but I knew the shape of that chin. I knew the arch of those eyebrows, even though they were furrowed in misery. Mom, the word was a croak. It was broken glass in a throat that hadn't spoken in days. I couldn't breathe. My vision tunneled. It was Chloe. My baby, the glowing bride I had left at the altar 3 years ago, was gone. Standing in her place was a skeleton wrapped in soaked cotton. She was shivering so hard her teeth were audibly chattering. She didn't have a coat, she didn't have a bag. She was clutching a plastic grocery sack against her chest like it was the crown jewels. I stared at her. My brain tried to reject the image. This wasn't my Chloe. My Chloe wore silk. My Chloe laughed. My Chloe was protected. Mom, she whispered again, and her knees gave out. She crumbled. She didn't fall forward, she just collapsed straight down onto the wet pavement of my porch. The paralysis broke. Chloe, I screamed her name. It tore out of my throat, raw and terrified. I dropped to my knees in the rain, ignoring the cold, ignoring the water soaking through my linen pants. I grabbed her shoulders. She felt frail. She felt like a bird made of hollow bones. I pulled her against me. She was ice cold. I found you, she sobbed into my shoulder. I knew you. I knew you wouldn't really leave. I dragged her into the shop. I kicked the door shut against the wind. I collapsed on the floor with her, holding her shivering body against mine. The smell of rain and sickness radiated off her. I brushed the wet hair out of her face. Chloe, I gasped, my hands trembling as I touched her freezing cheeks. Look at you, my God, look at you. She opened her eyes. They were red-rimmed and terrified. He took it all, Mom, she choked out. My blood ran cold, colder than the rain. Who? I demanded, though I already knew the answer. Jarred, she wept, her fingers digging into my arms with desperate strength. He took the house. He took the savings. He gambled the loans. She squeezed her eyes shut. He told me you abandoned us, she whispered. He told me you hated me. I felt the anger ignite in my gut. It wasn't the slow burn of 3 years ago. It was a nuclear flash. I didn't leave you, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous low register. I left him. He kicked me out, she said, the words spilling out in a hysteria. Yesterday, he said I was useless without your money. He said I was just a mouth to feed. She looked down at the plastic bag she was still clutching. She opened it slightly. Inside was a singular, tattered teddy bear. The one I had bought her when she was 4. That was it. That was all she had left of the life I had built for her. I looked at her haggard face. I looked at the way her collarbones protruded through her wet shirt. She was starving. My daughter was starving. I pulled her head down to my chest and rocked her. I stared at the rows of silent books. I had come here to find peace. I had come here to bury Blythe Thorn. But as I felt my daughter's ribs against my own, I knew the peace was over. Mara, the quiet bookstore owner, died in that moment. And Blythe Thorn didn't just wake up. She rose from the grave with a thirst for blood. You're safe, I whispered into her wet hair. You're safe now. I looked out the window at the storm raging outside. And he, I said to the darkness, is going to wish he had disappeared when he had the chance. I'm Blythe Thorn, 52 years old, and 3 years ago I vanished from my only daughter's wedding to teach a greedy man a lesson in humility. The bell above the door jingled, cutting through the silence of the shop like a knife. I stiffened behind the counter. My hand instinctively went to the heavy brass letter opener I kept next to the register. It had been 12 hours since Mia collapsed on my doorstep. 12 hours since I bathed the road, grit off her skin, and tucked her into my own bed, listening to her weep until exhaustion claimed her. She was asleep in the back room now, sedated by safety and the sound of the ocean. I looked toward the entrance. The man standing there was a ghost of the arrogance I remembered. Jarred. He didn't see me at first. His eyes were scanning the shelves of dusty classics, looking for something he could sneer at. But the sneer didn't come. He looked wrecked. The bespoke Italian tuxedo I remembered from the altar was gone, replaced by a suit that fit him poorly, the fabric cheap and shiny at the elbows. His hair, once gelled into aggressive perfection, was limp and overdue for a cut. He looked thinner, hollow. He turned his head and locked eyes with me. For a second, I saw the shock register in his face. The realization that the rumor was true, that the woman in the linen tunic and no makeup was actually the formidable Blythe Thorne. Blythe, he breathed, stepping forward. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I stood as still as a statue carved from granite. It's Mara, I said, my voice flat and devoid of warmth. To you, I'm a stranger. What do you want? He faltered, his hands twitching at his sides. He looked desperate, like a drowning man reaching for driftwood. I looked everywhere for you, he stammered, walking closer to the counter. We didn't know if you were alive. I'm not, I said coldly. Blythe Thorne is dead, he flinched. Please, he said, and his voice cracked. We need help, we're drowning Blythe. I watched him carefully, analyzing the sweat beading on his upper lip. Who is we? I asked. Mia and I, he said quickly, and Leo. Leo. The name hit me in the chest like a hammer. A grandson. I had a grandson. I kept my face perfectly blank, locking my knees to keep them from shaking. Who is Leo? I asked, feigning ignorance. Your grandson, Jarred said, his eyes pleading, filling with tears that looked disturbingly genuine. He's beautiful, Blythe, he has your eyes. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Mia hadn't mentioned a name last night. She had just clutched that bear and sobbed. And Mia, I asked, testing the trap. How is my daughter? Jarred ran a hand through his greasy hair. She's not good, he lied smoothly. She's struggling. She tries to keep it together for Leo, but the eviction notices. The debt. It's crushing her. She cries every night missing you. Rage, hot and white, flared in my stomach. He was standing there 3 feet away from me, painting a picture of a struggling family unit. He was using my daughter, the woman he had kicked out onto the street with nothing but a plastic bag, as a prop in his sob story. He didn't know she was 30 feet away, sleeping in my bed. He didn't know I knew everything. Business didn't go well? I asked, my voice dangerously soft. He let out a bitter laugh. It all fell apart, he admitted, leaning on the counter, invading my space. The investments, they were bad calls. I tried, Blythe. I tried to build an empire like yours, but the market turned. We're losing the house next week. If we don't come up with 50,000 by Friday, we're on the street. Leo will be on the street. He looked at me with those hollow, desperate eyes. I know you hated me, he whispered. I know I was arrogant, but don't punish Mia and Leo for my mistakes. Please, just a loan, anything. I looked at his hands. They were shaking. He was terrified, but he was also a liar. He was trying to secure a payout before I found out he had discarded my daughter like trash. Or worse, he was holding the child hostage. If Mia was here, where was Leo? A sick feeling curled in my gut. If he had kicked Mia out, he must have kept the boy. He was using the child as leverage, knowing Mia wouldn't leave town without him, knowing I would pay anything to save my blood. You said Mia is struggling, I said slowly. Where is she right now? He hesitated for a fraction of a second. She's at the house, he said, packing, trying to figure out where we go next. Liar, and the boy. With her, he said, they're waiting for me. Another lie. If Mia was here and the boy was with her at the house, then the boy was alone, or with a nanny, or with Jard's parents, or Jard had abandoned them both and was just using their names to grift me one last time. But I couldn't blow my cover yet. I needed to know where my grandson was. I needed to know how deep this rot went. 50,000, I repeated. To save the house, he nodded eagerly, seeing a crack in the armor. To give us time to get back on our feet, I swear I'll pay you back every cent. I reached under the counter, not for the checkbook, for the shotgun I kept for looters. My fingers brushed the cold steel barrel, grounding me. I didn't pull it out, not yet. I don't have $50,000 in cash, Jard, I lied. I sell used books for $3 a pop. His face fell, the mask of desperation cracking into irritation. You're Blythe Thorn, he hissed. You have millions stashed away. Everyone knows you didn't leave empty-handed. There it was, the greed. It was still there, lurking beneath the cheap suit and the tears. I'll tell you what, I said, leaning forward, my eyes locking onto his. You bring Mia and Leo here tomorrow. Let me see them. Let me see that they are safe and together. If you do that, I'll write you a check for 100,000. His eyes widened, greed warred with panic. He knew he couldn't produce Mia. He knew he had exiled her. She's very sick, he stammered. She's ashamed. She might not want to see you. Then you get nothing, I said, crossing my arms. He stared at me, his jaw working. He was calculating. He was figuring out how to force Mia to come back or how to trick me. Tomorrow, he said, his voice tight. Noon. Noon, I agreed. He turned and walked out of the shop, the bell jingling cheerfully behind him. I watched him get into a rusted sedan and drive away. My hands were trembling now, not from fear, from the adrenaline of the hunt. I locked the door and flipped the sign to closed. I walked to the back room. Mia was sitting up in bed, awake. Her eyes were wide, red-rimmed, and terrified. She had heard everything. He has Leo, she whispered, her voice breaking into a sob. He told me if I tried to take him, he'd call the police and say I kidnapped him. He said I was unfit because I have no money. I sat on the edge of the bed and took her cold hands in mine. He made a mistake, I said, my voice turning into the steel that had built a conglomerate. What mistake? She sniffled. He came here, I said, and he invited the devil back into his life. I stood up and walked to the closet where I kept the old life. I pulled out a locked metal box. Inside were 2 phones, a passport, and a stack of cash thick enough to choke a horse. Rest, Mia, I said, dialing a number I hadn't called in 3 years. Tomorrow at noon, Jard is going to learn that eviction is the least of his problems. I'm Blythe Thorn, 55 years old, and 3 years ago I walked out of a ballroom with nothing but a clutch purse to prove that my absence was worth more than my fortune. The bell above the door of my antique bookstore didn't just jingle, it screamed. The sound sliced through the heavy silence of the shop, shattering the peace I had carefully constructed over 1,000 days of solitude. I froze behind the mahogany counter. My fingers gripped the spine of a first edition Dickens, my knuckles turning white. I knew that walk. I knew the heavy, entitled cadence of those footsteps before the figure even fully cleared the doorframe. I didn't need to look up to know that my past had finally tracked me down to this sleepy coastal town. I looked up anyway. Jard stood there, framed by the gray light of the overcast afternoon. The last time I saw him, he was toasting to my health with a glass of crystal champagne, his eyes gleaming with the anticipation of my bank accounts. Now he looked like a building that had been condemned. His once immaculate hair was long and greasy, tucked poorly behind his ears. His suit was a cheap polyester blend that shined in all the wrong places, straining at the buttons around his midsection. He looked hollowed out by the very greed I had diagnosed him with 3 years ago. He squinted into the dim light of the shop, his eyes adjusting to the smell of dust and sea salt. Then he saw me. I watched the recognition hit him like a physical blow. His mouth fell open, a slack-jawed display of shock that quickly morphed into something uglier. Relief? No, anger. You, he rasped, his voice cracking. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I forced my heart to beat at a steady rhythm, willing my blood pressure to remain calm despite the adrenaline flooding my veins. Can I help you? I asked, my voice cool and detached, the voice of a stranger. He stormed toward the counter, his hands balling into fists at his sides. You're alive, he spat, the words dripping with accusation. We thought you were dead. We filed the reports. We held the memorial. I am dead, I said calmly. Blythe Thorne died the night of the wedding. My name is Mara. He slammed his hands onto the glass countertop. The display case rattled, the vintage fountain pens inside jumping at the impact. Don't play games with me, Blythe, he hissed, leaning in close. I could smell him. Stale coffee, old sweat, and the sour tang of desperation. You think you can just disappear? He shouted, his voice rising, filling the small space. Do you have any idea what you did to us? I stared at him, my expression unyielding stone. I removed myself from the equation, jarred. I thought that's what you wanted. You said I was controlling, overbearing. You took the money, he screamed. There it was, the truth stripped of all pleasantries within 60 seconds. He didn't care that his mother-in-law was alive. He cared that the ATM had walked away. You took the accounts, he continued, his eyes wild. The wedding gift. You promised us $5 million to start our life and then you vanished and the accounts froze. You stole that future from us. I felt a dark, cold laugh bubbling in my chest, but I swallowed it down. I stole nothing, I said softly. I simply didn't sign the transfer. He dragged a hand down his face, his skin sallow and gray. We lost everything, he said, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. The condo, the cars. I tried to keep the firm going, but without your backing. The investors pulled out. We're drowning, Blythe. He looked at me with pleading eyes, a predator trying to mimic a puppy. And now you're here, he said, sitting on a hoard of cash, playing shopkeeper while your family starves. Family? I asked, the word tasting like ash. Where is my daughter? He hesitated. It was a micro-expression, a flicker of the eyes to the left, but I caught it. I had spent 30 years in boardrooms reading liars. Jard was an amateur. She's at the motel, he lied. Down the highway. She's sick, Blythe. She can hardly walk from the stress. She cries for you every night. My stomach clenched. He didn't know that Mia was currently asleep in the back room of this very shop, sedated by exhaustion, safe in my bed. He didn't know I had spent the last 12 hours listening to her recount how he had thrown her out 3 days ago because she couldn't borrow money from her friends anymore. And my grandson? I asked, testing the depth of his depravity. Jard's eyes lit up. He saw an opening. Leo, he breathed. He's 2, he's a little angel. But he's hungry, Blythe. He's sleeping in a motel bathtub because we can't afford a crib. Is that what you want, for your blood to live like trash? Rage is a funny thing. Sometimes it burns hot like a forest fire. But this rage was cold. It was the absolute zero of space. He was using a child I had never met, a child he was currently hiding from his mother as leverage to open my wallet. I want to see them, I said. Give me the money first, he demanded, extending a trembling hand. 50,000, cash. Right now, just to get us into an apartment, then I'll bring them. No, I said. He recoiled as if I'd slapped him. What? I don't keep $50,000 in a register, Jard, I lied smoothly. And I don't pay ransoms. I leaned forward, invading his personal space, my eyes locking onto his. You bring Mia and Leo here, I commanded, letting the voice of the CEO slip through the facade of the bookseller. Tomorrow, noon, I want to see them with my own eyes. I want to see that they are healthy. If you do that, I will write you a check that will solve all your problems. He licked his lips. I could see the gears turning. He knew he didn't have Mia. He knew he would have to find her, drag her back, force her to play happy family for 1 hour to get the payout. He didn't know she was already out of his reach. Noon, he agreed, his voice tight. But have the check ready. I'm not playing around, Blythe. If you try to run again, I'll go to the press. I'll tell them everything. I wouldn't dream of it, I said. He turned and marched out, the bell jingling cheerfully behind him, mocking the tension in the room. I watched him get into a rusted sedan and peel away from the curb. My knees finally buckled. I sank onto the stool behind the counter, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He had Leo. He had the boy somewhere, likely with his parents, likely confused and scared. I turned my head toward the curtain that separated the shop from my living quarters. Mia stood there. She was wrapped in my oversized wool cardigan, her face pale and streaked with fresh tears. She had heard every word. He's going to hurt him, she whispered, her voice trembling. If he can't find me, he'll take it out on Leo. I stood up, the weakness in my legs replaced by a terrifying clarity. I walked over to her and gripped her shoulders. He won't have the chance, I said. I went to the safe beneath the floorboards and spun the dial. I pulled out the burner phone I had kept for emergencies and a heavy envelope of cash. Jard thinks he's coming tomorrow to collect a check, I said, dialing the number of a private security contractor I used to keep on retainer. He's wrong. I looked at my daughter, seeing the steel that lay beneath her sorrow. He's coming to his execution, I promised. And we're going to get your son back. I'm Blythe Thorne, 55 years old, and today I realized that the cold steel of a boardroom negotiation is nothing compared to the icy resolve of a mother protecting her young. The grandfather clock in the corner of the shop ticked away the seconds. Tick, tock. It was 11:59 a.m. Dust motes danced in the shaft of light cutting through the front window, oblivious to the violence hanging in the air. My hands rested flat on the cool mahogany counter. They were steady. My heart, however, was a distinct thumping rhythm against my ribs, a war drum beating a cadence of anticipation. I wasn't afraid. Fear had evaporated the moment I saw the bruises on my daughter's arms last night. Now there was only execution. The bell above the door chimed. It was exactly noon. Jard walked in, and the atmosphere in the shop instantly soured. He had tried to clean himself up, but the desperation still clung to him like a cheap cologne. He wore a blazer that was too tight across the shoulders, and his eyes darted around the room, scanning for traps, scanning for money. He didn't see the two men in plain clothes browsing the history section. He didn't see the camera lens glinting from the high shelf behind me. He only saw me and the checkbook sitting conspicuously on the counter. He marched up to me, a smug, predatory grin stretching his thin lips. "You're ready," he said, not asking. I looked him in the eye. "I am a woman of my word, Jard." He licked his lips, his gaze dropping greedily to the leather checkbook. "Good, that's good." He reached into his pocket, his hand shaking slightly. "Where are they?" I asked. My voice was soft, devoid of the tremor that used to define our interactions. He hesitated. "They're in the car," he lied. The lie was so smooth, so practiced. "Leo was sleeping," he continued, leaning in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And Mia? Well, she's a mess, Blythe. She's ashamed to see you. She said she needs the money before she can face you." I stared at him, I dissected him, I saw the twitch in his left eye, I saw the sweat beading on his upper lip. "Bring them inside," I said. The deal was noon, in person. His jaw tightened. "Don't push me, Blythe," he snapped, his facade cracking. I have them, that's what matters. You write the check, I hand over the keys to the car, and you can go play grandma. But I need the money now. The loan sharks, they aren't patient. Slammed his hand on the counter. Write the damn check. I looked down at the checkbook. I picked up my fountain pen. The heavy black resin felt familiar in my hand, a weapon I had wielded for 30 years to build an empire. I opened the book. Jard exhaled, a sound of pure, pathetic relief. I uncapped the pen. I hovered the nib over the pay to the order of line. You said my wedding gift was to disappear, I said, my eyes still on the paper. We were stressed. He waved a dismissive hand. Water under the bridge, just sign it. You told me that my money was a noose around your neck, I continued, watching the ink bleed slightly into the air. You said you wanted to build a life without my interference, without my shadow. I said a lot of things, he shouted, losing patience. Just sign the check, you old hag. I stopped. I slowly capped the pen. I looked up, meeting his frantic gaze with a look of absolute zero. I honored your request perfectly, Jard. I closed the checkbook and slid it into the drawer beneath the counter. The sound of the drawer sliding shut was final. What are you doing? He whispered, the color draining from his face. I disappeared, I said calmly. I didn't scream. I didn't let the rage that was boiling my blood show on my face. I let the silence stretch tight as a piano wire. Blythe Thorne died 3 years ago, I informed him, my voice steady. Her accounts were closed. Her assets were liquidated and placed into irrevocable trusts for her grandson. Trusts that you cannot touch. Trusts that I cannot touch. His mouth fell open. You're lying. I am a ghost, Jard, I said, leaning forward. I have nothing, no millions, no liquid assets, just this shop and the books on the shelves. I smiled, and it felt like baring fangs. And dead women don't sign checks. The shock on his face was a pathetic sight. It wasn't just disappointment, it was the total collapse of his world. His knees actually buckled and he gripped the counter to stay upright. But, the ransom, he stammered. You said. I lied, I said. You can't do this, he shrieked, lunging forward. I have your daughter, I have your grandson, you think I won't hurt them? No, a voice said from behind the curtain. You don't. Jard froze. He turned his head slowly like a rusted machine. Mia stepped out from the back room. She wasn't the broken girl he described. She was standing tall, holding her sleeping son, my grandson, tightly against her chest. She looked at her husband with eyes that had finally cleared of the fog he had kept her in. It's over, Jard, she said. Jard made a sound like a wounded animal. He looked from Mia to me, his brain unable to process the trap that had just snapped shut on his leg. You, he pointed a shaking finger at me. You kidnapped them. I rescued them, I corrected. I picked up the heavy, black rotary phone on the counter. I didn't look at the keypad as I dialed 3 digits. You have 5 minutes before the sheriff arrives, I said, my voice devoid of the old Blythe softness. Although, considering the men standing by the history section are private security, I doubt you'll make it to the door. Jard spun around. The 2 customers had turned. They weren't reading anymore. They were blocking the exit, their arms crossed, their expressions grim. Jard looked back at me, tears of rage and impotence streaming down his greasy face. You ruined my life, he screamed. I held the receiver to my ear, listening to the dial tone switch to a ringing line. No, Jard, I said, watching him crumble. I just stopped funding it. I'm Blythe Thorne, 55 years old, and I used to believe power was measured in stock options and board seats. But I now know it's measured by the silence that falls after a predator is removed from your home. The red and blue lights of the sheriff's cruiser slashed through the dusty air of the bookstore. They strobed against the rows of antique hardcovers. They danced across the terrified, furious face of my son-in-law. I stood behind the counter, my hands gripping the edge so hard my knuckles turned the color of old parchment. Jard wasn't going quietly. He was thrashing against the grip of the two deputies who had taken over from my private security team. "She's lying," he screamed, his voice cracking, raw with desperation. "She has millions. She's committing fraud. Arrest her." I didn't say a word. I simply watched. I watched the man who had called me a burden, the man who had isolated my daughter, the man who had threatened my grandson, get shoved into the back of a squad car like a common drunk. He pressed his face against the glass. His eyes met mine one last time. There was no triumph in my chest. There was only a hollow, exhausting relief. I felt like I had just run a marathon with a lung full of smoke. The sheriff, a man I knew only as Jim from the local diner, tipped his hat to me before sliding into the driver's seat. He didn't know who I really was. To him, I was just the quiet woman who sold books and paid her taxes on time. The cruiser pulled away, gravel crunching under the tires, the siren chirping once as they turned onto the main road. Then silence. The absolute, ringing silence of the coast. I turned to look at Mia. She was sitting on the velvet reading chair, Leo asleep in her lap. She looked younger than she had in years. The tension that had drawn tight lines around her mouth was gone, replaced by a soft, bewildered exhaustion. "He's gone, Mom," she whispered. "He's gone," I confirmed. My voice sounded rusty. "What do we do now?" she asked, looking down at her son. I walked over to her. I reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. My fingers trembled. "You go to the farmhouse," I said gently. "The deed is in the safe. It's under a shell company. He can't find it. Nobody can." "And you?" she asked, her eyes searching mine. "I stay here," I said. She started to protest, shifting Leo in her arms. "But you can come with us. We can be a family again." I shook my head slowly. "No, Mia, Blythe Thorne, the CEO, is dead. She has to stay dead for you to be safe. If I come back into the light, the lawyers, the press, the debts, they all come back too." Jard's lawyers would have a field day. I leaned down and kissed her forehead. "I am a ghost," I whispered. "And ghosts don't haunt the living, they protect them from the shadows." I helped her pack the car I had arranged. I buckled Leo into his seat without waking him. I watched my daughter drive away, heading toward a future I had bought for her with the death of my past life. I stood in the driveway until her tail lights were swallowed by the bend in the road. My legs finally gave out. I sat down heavily on the wooden steps of the porch. The adrenaline was leaving my system, taking all my warmth with it. I shivered. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out the burner phone. I dialed the number I had memorized 3 years ago. It rang twice. "It's done," I said into the receiver. "Ms. Thorne," the voice on the other end was clipped, professional. "My attorney, the only person on earth who knew my location." "Initiate the protocol," I commanded. "The Phoenix Trust." "Are you sure?" he asked. "Once I sign this, the irrevocable trust is locked. The assets are completely severed from your control. It will pay out to the beneficiary anonymously. You will have zero access to those funds. You will be destitute on paper." I looked out toward the horizon. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and burning orange. "I don't need the money," I said. "I have the bookstore. I have enough to eat." "And the beneficiary?" "Leo," I said, my voice catching on his name. "Ensure his tuition is covered. Ensure Mia has a monthly stipend that looks like an insurance payout. Make sure they never see my name on a single document." "Understood," he said. "It's done. Goodbye, Ms. Thorne." "Goodbye," I said. I hung up. I cracked the phone in half. I tossed the pieces into the tall grass beside the porch. I was poor now, truly, legally poor. I wrapped my arms around myself against the rising wind coming off the Atlantic. I could hear the waves crashing against the cliffs below, a rhythmic, eternal thumping that sounded like the heartbeat of the world. I watched the sunset hit the white caps, turning the ocean into a field of diamonds and blood. I took a deep breath. The air smelled of salt and pine and freedom. For 30 years, I had chased relevance. I had chased legacy. I had thought that having my name on a building was immortality. But as the first star appeared in the darkening sky, I realized I had been wrong. I had given Mia her life back. I had given Leo a future free from his father's toxicity. I sat alone on a porch that needed painting, wearing a sweater that was unraveling at the cuff. I had never felt richer. I am Blythe Thorne. I am a mother. I am a grandmother. And as the night finally claimed the coastline, I understood that the greatest gift I ever gave myself wasn't the empire I built or the money I made. It was the courage to stay gone.